Quite a few big name pastors are being exposed lately and falling hard in the public eye. What I want you to do is imagine what really made way for this, how that even happened over time. And then the question is, could we be in danger of that same thing if indeed we go too long with neglecting the presence of God and intimacy with Him? Because I believe the deeper problem at the core of these things is that what if there's a continual neglect of God's presence that's a factor in these situations? Let's talk about it.
You're listening to Above Reproach Church Podcast, a podcast created for the local church. Our goal is to tackle tough church issues through thoughtful conversations like the one you're about to hear. Whether you're a church leader or a layperson, we pray this episode empowers you to play your role within the global, timeless family of God. This is Above Reproach Church Podcast.
Tanner.
Yes, sir.
Hello, this is our first episode, Above Reproach Church Podcast.
What in the world?
Here we are.
What's happening?
Guys, this is a smaller portion of our online ministry, Above Reproach Ministry. Mm-hmm. We have a bunch of stuff going on, so before we jump into the content for today, go to abovereproachministry.com. Check out all that we have available to you. Tanner, you recommended that we share a little bit of our heart and our mission behind this. I'll share a little bit of my end, and then you can kind of speak into what you're hoping, what you envision for this.
Yeah.
My heart behind this is that I know there's a lot of church leaders, moms, dads, your typical everyday Christian spouse or content creator online that's just trying to get in the online space and be faithful to God, who just feels unequipped, doesn't really know the conversations they need to have and think through. And so what we want to do is always to equip people, train people up. And I think specifically this is going to be as regards the greater picture of the global church, how to function as a global church. So we'll be addressing like church issues, conversations that relate to the individual, whether you are an online content creator or whether you're in church leadership at a local community, or you're just a parent trying to go, I want to disciple my kids well. And we hope that we'll add value to your life and equip you, because I see a need for that, to not just talk about the overall general principles of how to do it well, but the deeper conversations that I don't believe a lot of people know to have, or even know to think through if they're even having them. So what's a little bit about your heart behind this? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of starting off, we started our house church here in Jacksonville, Florida. And what I saw as we started the book of Acts is a separation between the modern church and our Western culture church and the Church of Acts. And I guess like as I'm going through Acts and I'm studying through Acts, I see that there's an intentionality behind the church, that there's a unity behind the church. And like, I guess, the phrase that really stuck out to me was that they were with one accord. And so that really stuck out to me. And so my heart really is to unify the church and to bring back that intentionality in our minds as church leaders, as content creators, as parents, whatever that might look like, that there's an intentionality, that there's an urgency to unify the church in our modern state. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is the underlying heartbeat of this, is to promote unity, love. And not to say the Church of Acts is the ultimate standard of perfection, but there's a lot that I think we can go back to and adopt and even conform to our modern culture in a way that works. And so we just want to talk big church picture, how to function globally as the family of God, how to do that well in a local context, in our families, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our job, at our school, whatever it ends up being. So, the big question today is not just relating to like the rise and fall of big mega church pastors and those who have tremendous spotlight and they're exposed and their sin is like, wow, how did they get there? But more relating to that issue, the bigger picture is how to prioritize and balance the presence of God in the midst of ministry responsibility, in the midst of all the content, all the planning, all the different duties, all the different things that spiral in our heads as church leaders, as pastors, as shepherds, as moms and dads, as content creators online. How do we prioritize and balance the presence of God? Because I'm not saying that's like the only reason why people get to that point and why they fall so hard, but I think for 99% of the different times that happens, that's a big factor in it. And so a good opening question is it possible to become distracted from the best thing, which we know is the presence of God, intimacy with God? Is it possible to become distracted from the best thing by good things like ministry and church life and serving your local church and loving your kids and serving your wife? Is it possible to allow those things to overshadow what is ultimate in our life, which is the presence of God? And then the second question, I guess, is how do you not become distracted if that's indeed a possibility? How do we guard ourselves against that in the midst of doing all these good things that we justify as a good enough reason to abandon the presence of God on a daily basis or for a period of a week? Well, I got to get this done. The church needs this. How do we not become distracted, by what is the mission of our church or our life from the presence of God?
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to say that I'm serving God, but really the heart is, why are you serving God? You can, like, unintentionally or without even really realizing, you can idolize those good deeds that you're doing. So the real reason or the real thing is, why am I doing good? Like, what is the purpose behind it? Is my drive to serve God and to be in his presence and to also present his presence to other people in a way of through my acts of service, through loving people, through serving people? Or am I doing good in order to have self-promotion? Like, am I promoting self through what I'm doing? Because I can go into a youth group, right, just for example, and I can have the heart of serving a student just for them to see Christ either through my actions or see Christ through the lesson or through worship or whatever you're doing by serving. Or I can go into a youth group to show off and promote myself so that I can look cooler to the younger generation. Like, whatever it is, it's the heart behind it that really counts.
So it is possible, I think, is what we're hitting on, is it is possible to become distracted from the presence of God in the name of serving him and doing things for him and serving the people and promoting what, helps the church overall, and you neglect the presence of God in the process. And I think that is one of the biggest issues for anyone who's in a leadership position as a believer.
Right.
Whether it's family leadership, whether it's church leadership at work. I think this is turning more into, and always the heartbeat behind this has been to address church leaders, but also like anyone who is a leader in their context. So I think one of the ways you don't become distracted by good things from the presence of God is to actually put that time with God into your schedule as a non-negotiable. That's something that stood the test of time since I started ministry. That's a constant that I've had over the past, 8 years in ministry, is when I was working as a youth pastor and now when I'm in online ministry. It's always been, no matter what, I work around my time with God rather than pencil him in if it ends up working out at the end of the day.
That's good.
Because I want everything to revolve around and flow from my time with God. If I don't have that, then I lack the power, the energy, the real supernatural strength that people need to see infused within my activity. Otherwise, you're just running on a treadmill by your own strength, if not, from a place of seeking God first. So I think the presence of God ultimately becomes, for lack of better terms, the power source of all our activity, of all our service. And I think we've seen people who are obviously serving or leading without that intimacy. Not that we can make that ultimate judgment call, but it comes off as there seems to be like a lack of authenticity to what they're saying and doing. Like they haven't been with God. They just read a textbook and they're regurgitating a bunch of things that they learned from someone who actually has a real relationship with God and abiding, seeking his presence first. How do you practically prioritize God's presence? I guess in the midst of ministry specifically, but I mean, you could generalize that to being a parent, being with all my work responsibilities and trying not to take my work home with me, but it ends up being something that's inevitable. How do I practically prioritize God's presence in the midst of all my other responsibilities? How would you answer that?
I guess my answer would be first to seek an abiding Christ. When I'm in a day-to-day basis, when I'm seeking after serving God, my number one goal is to walk in the ways of Christ in every situation. So when I'm approaching being a parent, when I'm approaching being a small group leader, when I'm approaching being a worship leader, when I'm approaching being a content creator, my first goal is to glorify Christ through it. And if I'm not, then, performance-based service is not service. It's not. You have to point yourself to a point where you are worshiping God through everything that you do. So I guess when you're looking at, how not to become distracted by that mission is to limit distractions in your life. I have to analyze what I'm being distracted by in my day-to-day life. Am I being distracted by social media? Am I being distracted by worldly entertainment? Am I being distracted by Netflix and all those different things? What's pulling me away from pointing myself back to reflecting on how I'm serving, or reflecting on my heart, reflecting on my actions, reflecting on everything that I'm doing in order to serve and glorify Christ? So I think just taking a step back, like taking a moment, because one of the greatest things in problem solving when you're facing issues or you're facing, life problems is you take a step back, you take a moment, you take a breath, and you analyze, okay, like in these different areas, if it's at school, if it's at work, is wherever it's at, if it's at the grocery store, wherever I'm at, how am I glorifying Christ? What are my actions like? So I have to take a step back, take a breath, analyze the situation, and see, okay, where am I missing my Christ-like actions in these areas? And so that's what I would have to say.
That is a fantastic point. That I think you get to a place where you're not even aware of the fact that you've neglected the presence of God so long, because you didn't, I guess, have that daily discipline of analyzing where you're at honestly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what needs to happen, especially as a leader who has more responsibility and is more accountable for the people they're leading, is there needs to be that discipline, and whatever it is you need to set in place to have this, but you need to at least daily step back and really analyze. Don't fall into the paralysis of over-analysis where you analyze yourself into a paralyzed state of not doing nothing, but at least take a step back daily and go, am I, in fact, prioritizing the presence of God in everything, not just above everything, right? Because it's not just, I have my time with God, my time in His Word, and my time in prayer, and then I go to work, and then I go and serve my kids, and then I work in children's ministry at church. But it's also, I'm partnering with God firstly in those things. And so I think that is a great way to practically prioritize the presence of God, is be aware of the fact that we wander. And when you're aware of that, it humbles you into a state of needing to constantly take a step back and make sure I'm not working from a place of self-centeredness or self-reliance or, lack of dependency on God. And so I think as long as you orient all of your activity and content and preaching and service and shepherding around your intimacy with God, all of that other stuff, I think like Matthew 6:33 teaches, you seek first the kingdom, all these other things kind of work out, the things that God intends for you. You remove that one piece that makes everything else move in tandem, you lose your rhythm, and you start to wander into a place of not even realizing that you're kind of working on limited strength that isn't God's, because you've, kind of been working without Him for so long. I think that's the scary thing, is you can have a lot of success, worldly success, without God, and assume that that's His stamp of approval, is the very fact that there's success. But I think success can also come by way of working without Him just as much as with Him. So we have to learn how to define success properly, to know whether or not we're in fact partnering with God or wandering away from Him into an idea of success that He never said was true success. Yeah,
and if I might add too, like one of the most disappointing things as a leader, or as a leader looking down at other leaders as you're leading people, is to see a leader that is out of focus of the mission. And so when I'm analyzing myself, I have to think, okay, am I lining myself up with the mission of either my church, either my, the content creating that I'm a part of, my parenting with my spouse? Like, am I in line? Am I focused on the mission, which is truly leading people, discipling people to make disciples? So in all of my areas of life, am I focused on the mission? Am I focused on the why and what I am I'm doing. And I know for me, like the most disappointing seasons of ministry has been when I've walked away and I looked back and I was like, oh my gosh, in that entire season, I was unfocused on the mission to the point where I look back with regret and guilt and shame, which, I mean, isn't healthy to live in. But when you look back and you feel that conviction and you get to move forward in repentance and walking in this new light of, okay, I'm regrouping, I'm refocusing, and I'm looking at the mission, and I need to be more intentional. I need to have an urgency for these people that I'm leading, for my kids, for my audience, for whoever it is. And so for me, one of the most, hard seasons is when I've looked back and I was like, I was not very intentional in that season. It's hard.
Yeah, that's another good point is to, leaders need to have a healthy, periodical time of looking back, not living in the past, but, looking back and learning and going, man, did God really call me to do that? Or did I just act on a good idea, bring it before people that I knew would, agree with me, looking for confirmation bias, and then I ran with it when God never actually gave me permission or even told me that was what he wanted. And again, that goes back to the scary thing of you can have a kind of success that appears to have God's favor on it, when in fact you couldn't be farther from him. And success can be that kind of snare that the enemy uses to keep you from the presence of God and too busy to seek him. And when we say like prioritize intimacy with God, we are talking about praying. We are talking about having periods of fasting and opening the Bible and having your daily time in the scriptures and being sanctified by the truth. That has been, again, even shifting into online ministry, that has been the one thing that has remained constant for me in any mode of ministry I'm in. And I don't always do it perfectly, but it's at least a general discipline of I put you first. And that doesn't always look like I wake up and I just float to my Bible and it's just like I'm magnifying the Lord with my first breath. It doesn't always play out like that.
No, it doesn't.
But I try to, and when I don't, I at least make sure I get time with him. Because there's something about the life force of the believer is found wrapped up in the presence of God. And the longer you go without him, again, you just start to lose that strength, that passion, that zeal, that real energy and vibrancy God gives you through his presence. So even in online content creation, as someone who creates live Bible studies and all the stuff that I do, there have been a lot of studies I've done where it's like super intellectual, got my notes organized, and halfway through, I'm like mindlessly regurgitating the notes I made, and there's no evidence of like I'm partnering with God in this. Yeah. It's just me stating a bunch of facts that I know are true, but it's almost like it lacks that personal element to it of I have studied and sought the presence of God in the midst of this. And then there are times where I'll like preach a sermon and I pray prior to it. Like it's just a 15-minute video and I go, Lord, I just really want you to be in the midst of this. If you're not, I can say everything right and people can applaud, but it amounts to nothing. So would you please, like, I'm just trying to partner with you. And then there's something about that where you can sense like the presence of God in your communication, in the content you're making, where like your why is locked in. You have a deep concern for the people on the other side. You're like reflecting the heart of God in the midst of your preaching or teaching or content creation. And if you don't have that, your content might be good, your leadership might be good, your preaching might be good from a worldly standpoint, but what does God think about it, honestly, at the end of the day, if you're doing it apart from the leading of his Spirit? Because I know a lot of people, I'm not going to name any names, and I would name myself first, who have preached sermons without seeking the presence of God prior or even in the middle of it, and saying, Spirit of God, lead this time. You say what you want, and forget my notes. You say what you want, even if it's not something I wrote down, even if it's something, even if you purposely tell me not to say something I wrote down, just lead this time. So how do you balance the desire to know God with that desire to serve people? Because as leaders, in every context, we know our ultimate calling is to serve God through practically serving people, because he cares about people. So how do you balance that desire of like, I want to know God, but I also know that I'm called to serve people? How do I not it's that Mary and Martha balance.
Yeah.
It's the Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, and he goes, "You've chosen the better portion, Mary."
Yeah.
And Martha going, "But I did all this stuff." And Jesus goes, "Oh, your sister chose the better portion." How do I not fall into that overemphasis of service,
Sure.
but also like not being this closet Christian that just sits in my room all day and never actually benefits humanity?
Right.
How do you balance that as a leader, as a content creator, as a shepherd, whatever it may be?
Yeah, well, my mind goes straight to what kind of leader would you be, or what kind of, person who serves, like what kind of person would you be if you didn't know God or didn't strive to get to know him, and yet you were just trying to serve people at the same time? It kind of would be lousy. And there's a lot of those people, and I've been one of those people where I have tried to just serve, but my faith is lacking in that season. And people recognize that. People see that. It's so obvious when you see somebody who is serving, but they lack with that spirit in them. And so I guess to balance knowing God and serving people would have to be to prioritize knowing God and then to serve people.
That's a good point. Again, I'm going to say that every time you talk because it makes me happy to hear what you're saying. What comes to mind is Jesus. He's healing all the people. Mm-hmm. It's morning now. All the crowds are still looking for him. He hasn't healed everyone because there's just a line of people. Mm-hmm. And the disciples come to him. He's been seeking God in prayer. And they come and go, "Hey, all these people are looking for you. You get a lot of people who aren't healed yet. We're going to have an angry mob on our hands real fast." Mm-hmm. And Jesus goes, "Yep, time to move on." He escaped the crowds to be with the Father. Right. And then by doing so, he actually showed the disciples that he's not directed just by need. And I think if we as leaders it doesn't mean we don't care about needs. Yeah. It means we're not ultimately moved by needs alone. But when I see the needs of people around me, the Spirit of God directs me to address needs as he desires me to do so, because I can't answer every need in front of me. It's impractical. And so I think, like what you said, I'm the best human being to humanity when I've been with God. Yeah. If you don't get with the Father, you lack that authenticity, purity, integrity, whatever it is that people need to see and need to experience. You lack that without him actually leading you into that situation and actually having been with him. And so what you said is true, and absolutely don't be directed solely by the needs of people. Right. I know for those of us that have deeply compassionate hearts, it's like, but I really want to serve people. It's like, that's great. But Jesus wasn't moved by needs alone. In fact, he disappointed people. Yeah. And he left some needs unmet. He let some expectations down. Yeah. Because the Father was leading him elsewhere to tend to someone else's needs. And you have to be able to discern between when that is indeed the Lord leading you. And of course, we can't be lazy and just justify every opportunity you get to serve someone. You're like, well, I don't know if God's leading me. Sure. It's like, God, did you even seek him and ask? Or did you just assume and justify your laziness, you bozo? And so maybe we can spend a little bit of time speaking into, I don't know, I didn't even think about this prior, but some times where prioritizing God's presence was like an obvious success. You know what I mean? Like where you noticed, hey, I see a big difference right now in this moment because I know I've had my time with God. I sought him first. I spent time in prayer. Whatever it is, think of some times in your life where prioritizing God's presence was obviously successful. Obviously successful. For me, I just think of in youth ministry when I'd get around those kids. Yeah. And I just had such a frustration and a bitterness and just this overall, like, I want all of you out of this building right now. Leave my face. And that kind of, I don't know, like lack of love was an indication to me, oh my gosh, I didn't actually sit in the presence of God today to have his heart for the people I'm called to minister to. And it was obvious when I did, those days where I would walk in the room, and even though it was the same amount of like potential frustration, same amount of loudness and volume and complaining kids, same amount, I wasn't moved by that, but I had this compassion and genuine concern to sit with them and understand. And it was like, wow, I actually have the heart of God right now for you, and I'm recognizing it's because I've been with him, as opposed to those times I haven't. So I think those are some pretty obvious times for me, is I'm more patient and understanding, and I'm not so much of a dirtbag in front of these kids, and I'm not saying things I regret 2 seconds into seeing them. It's because I've been with him. Yeah. It's just your heart begins to match up with his the more you're with him. So what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, the times when I have felt drained and for me, I go back to youth ministry too, back in, where we were at, but when I was drained, when I walked into that building in youth ministry, was when I was distracted by outside, problems or issues that I was personally going with. Different things that I was dealing with in my life, the drama, the chaos that we all deal with in our own daily lives, whether it's relationships or, finances, even, things like that. When I was solely focused on those things, or when I was prioritizing those things, is when I walked into youth ministry with just an empty heart. And I can say this, that Spirit-led people will gravitate towards Spirit-filled people. And I felt most driven in my ministry when I saw my compassion, my love for the students in youth ministry, seeing my spirit and seeing my character and the things that I brought to the table fill up other people. Because oftentimes in ministry, there will be this example of your cup is pouring into others, which is why often you'll hear about burnout, is because people who are in ministry, they won't have time for themselves to get filled up. And so they will just feel drained because their job is to fill other people, be a vessel to fill other people up. And so for me, I felt most successful when I walked and I put away those distractions, or I gave those distractions up to Jesus and walking into the building, or sitting in my car and praying before I walked in, because that limited that distraction to bother me as I walked into my ministry setting. So,
yes, I was going to say something and I forgot what
burnout.
Burnout, yes.
Okay, cool.
Man, nailed it. Burnout. That's exactly, I think, like the step before a big fall or a big sin, or for these pastors that are getting exposed, of course, or for anyone. The step before that is burnout, is exhaustion that hasn't been dealt with, is a cup that hasn't been filled up for so long, and you're expected to like fill other people up and be there for people and meet their expectations and not disappoint them, and you have nothing to give. And so you sit in that place of, I'm scraping at the bottom of the barrel. You sit in that place for so long.
You do.
It's going to wear and tear on you, and it's going to make you extra vulnerable to the most heinous sins that you and I would never even think we do, but we're in that place of vulnerability because we haven't been filled up for so long. And so I have felt that in my life, these moments. And of course, we're just trying to help you leaders, or you potential leaders, future leaders, just to think through these things and put these safeguards up now. Like, don't wait until you reach a point of exhaustion where you're like, I think I'll take my relationship with God seriously.
Yeah, no.
It's orient your life around Him now, so that any service, activity, ideas, innovation, content that flows from your life is a product of being with God. Because if it's not, I'll tell you right now, it's garbage. And God can still do things with it.
Sure.
But it's not the maximal, kind of results that could have come from it. So, we've had moments like that where we're just burnt out. And we're not trying to say like the quick fix to that is always just pray for a minute and all of a sudden you're filled up and it's like, oh my gosh. But that does play a part in it. To sit with God and let Him fill you up. So, I think when it comes to the application, for those of you that are listening, as we talk through these things, We'll become more precise in our content, but for now, we want to put the first things first, and let you know that we are people that prioritize the presence of God as much as we can, and that's like this. I guess you could say like the secret sauce to the Christian life is to prioritize the presence of God above what you would consider the purpose of your life. So many of us sum up our purpose in like doing. Like, my purpose is to fill in the blank, get this job, be in this career, reach these people, create this nonprofit. But the purpose of your life really should actually be summed up. The totality of that is actually you being with God in order to be like him to your fellow man. That's your purpose. But nonetheless, we'll talk about that in future episodes, I'm sure. Some points of application that I think would be helpful for you guys to think through, and questions for you, is as you're trying to balance like personal intimacy with God with all the responsibilities on your life, think of the big why behind what you're doing. Your ministry, your ideas, your content, your music, your whatever decision you make to train your kids up. What's your why? And how does that actually connect to your personal intimacy with God? So if my why at work is I want to be a light to my unbelieving coworkers, if that's my why, think about how your personal intimacy with God actually affects that. You can shine brighter the more you've actually been with the one who is the light of your life. Or when it comes to like being in church leadership, my why, I'm here because I love people and I care for their faith. Okay, you can actually be of benefit to their faith and be a better, loving human being to them if you've actually been with one who is indeed love and fills you up with his love. Is there anything you want to say about the why behind not just ministry, but parenting and content? And these seem to be like the three main categories we're going to focus on throughout the entirety of this podcast, as we talk about church life, as we talk about how to function as the global, timeless family of God on an individual and collective scale. We're going to be talking about things like prioritizing the presence of God. And I'm going to be addressing specifically, because I'm an online content creator and have a heart for people like you, content creators, church leaders, and parents. That doesn't mean if you don't fit those categories, then this is not the podcast for you. This just means those are the people I'm intentionally going to frame up the applications around. And then you get to figure out, if you don't fit in those categories, how this applies to you. So what's the why behind, what you do and how that relates to your personal intimacy with God? What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think when we aren't focusing on that intimacy, or we aren't having that time spent, with God, we tend to blend in more than we do stand out. And that becomes a problem when you are trying to execute your why. Because normally when you are trying to execute your why, you're trying to replicate something or translate something or represent something to somebody. And if I'm just blending in, going through the motions, then I'm not going to execute my why very well. It won't be accomplished very well, because what my purpose is, what my mission is, and all those different things won't be done well if I'm just kind of blending in with everybody else, if that makes sense.
It does. So your why also has to be accurate, doesn't it? If you start off with a wrong, unbiblical why, why I want influence, I want money, not that influence and money are inherently bad things, but to pursue those as ultimate things can become detrimental. So if that's your why, then your content, your leadership is going to show that you value those things ultimately. So we need to constantly match up our why, because you can start with the right why, and then over time, your why starts to morph into something more worldly, something that God never actually told you is the big why behind what you do. So to constantly heart check, to constantly bring yourself before the Lord, and that's part of the reason we seek intimacy with God, is for self-evaluation and this processing of my own thoughts and desires, and go, Lord, am I really, my heart can be deceitful sometimes, Lord. Do I really have the why that I think I do, which is the why you say in Scripture, to love God, love neighbor, for your glory, all that stuff. So, second question, unless there's something you wanted to say about that.
I was going to say one more thing. Isn't it Psalm 139 where it says, search me and and know me and reveal any grievous way in me.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely butchered that. That was the Tanner version of the Bible. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that version.
Go to AboveReproachMinistry.com to get your TCV, your Tanner Coppernoll
TCV.
version of the Bible. Coming out this September.
Yeah. I would say that passage is very good to live by each day. If we aren't analyzing ourselves, then we're usually not progressing.
Self-reflection. That's the word.
Yeah. Reflection.
I couldn't think of the word. Self-reflection.
There you go.
Thank you. Be self-reflective, guys.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like really.
Reflect on yourself.
That's helpful. And the presence of God allows you to self-reflect properly.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of self-reflecting that's improper. And then it leads to shame and the sense of condemnation and like disappointment and insecurity.
Yeah.
But if you self-reflect with the Word of God as the basis for your reflection and it's in the presence of God, it's gonna be more helpful. So, second kind of applicational question for y'all is, be honest. Where in your life have you been neglecting opportunity to draw close to God? Where in your life have you been neglecting opportunity to draw close to God? Opportunities are bombarding us from every direction to actually tune in to the heart of God, the presence of God, the Word of God, and to actually align ourselves with those things. So, a secondary question is probably part of it. What's getting in the way of you prioritizing God's presence above all else? And this doesn't mean, because I've been here, where it's like, I swing towards extremes. That's what I do. So when I was in youth ministry and I'd realize, oh shoot, I'm a failure. I haven't been prioritizing God's presence. I would neglect everything in the name of putting God first, and I would just seek Him. And it would almost be to if I can say it like this, to an unhealthy degree, where it wasn't like, God, I'm going to seek you in order to do these things better. It's God, I'm seeking you in replacement of doing anything for you. And so I did nothing. And all my tasks started piling up and all my responsibilities started overwhelming me. And then I swung to the other extreme. I got to do all this stuff now. So God, I don't have time for you. And that seems to be like the spectrum of extremes that we as leaders like swing to is this, God's everything and nothing else matters. And then there's, sorry, God, too busy for you. Got to do all the stuff you want me to. And we're not saying like putting God first is neglecting everything else. It's actually like prioritizing Him in the midst of what you're doing with your finances, at your job, on your breaks, while you're driving, while you're interacting with your spouse, while you're parenting your kids, while you're going to school online and having integrity, while you're, kind of mapping out the business model and what you think it's going to look like. All these things to be aware and mindful of how God might want you to do them and what His Word says about how to do them well, and to think of His character in the process and to partner with Him. Yeah. Too many times, like my son does this to me, we try and do all these different things without asking for the help of our Father. And it's like, be holy, go serve the church, build the church, advance the kingdom, evangelize, disciple. And it's like, yes, Lord, yes. And He's like, whoa, I didn't say leave me. I said, rely on me to help you do these things. And instead, you're doing it on your own. Yes, Lord. No, don't stay here. Stay here. And as you go out, bring me with you. Be aware of my presence in the midst of those things. Anything you want to say? You seem like you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, at least in this season of life, that I've been trying to focus on more is just simply being a child of God. Because I am a person who likes to do, and I love to serve. I love to just go and do anything and everything I can, any opportunity I can to serve and things like that. I usually just like to throw myself out there, like I can do this, and that, like being a busybody almost. And I have found that when you put yourself out there like that, and then you force yourself into situations that may not necessarily be healthy for you, even though you're doing good things, right? The intentionality behind it is good. It may not be good for your heart and for your spirit to just do, rather than, taking a pause, taking a break, and breathing.
That's right. And let's not forget, you just said do like 3 times.
Do.
Where are we at? Well, I think that's that's enough on that point. We could spend maybe
Sure.
this is what we'll do in future episodes, because
Sure.
what we're trying to do is establish like the framework of not just the global timeless family of God, the global church, but the local church.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to help you function and play your role and use your gifts
Yeah.
and do your part with the small life we're given as part of your local church and the global timeless church. And part of that is, man, if every believer in the body of Christ prioritize the presence of God properly without neglecting what he's called them to do, and bringing him with them in the tasks of their life. Dude, can you imagine what the church would look like? It would be amazing. So that's why we're starting with this, is to say, like, above all and in all things, intimacy with God is primary.
Yeah.
Because that's what glorifies him. And we're after the glory of God in all that we do. So this is kind of the more communal aspect question, which we'll get to in a minute. But for now, let's cut to a break. So, Tanner,
Yes.
the communal aspect of this, prioritizing the presence of God, because we're talking individually, right?
Right.
The question becomes, and this is for you, listener, okay? Pay attention, drop the dishes, and listen. Think of how your personal intimacy with God impacts the community you're a part of. And
big
how can we begin making God's presence more of a value in our local communities? So not only think about like, wow, how my intimacy with...
It's all good. It's
use 12.
first podcast.
Think of how your personal intimacy with God impacts the community you're a part of. Just think about that. Think about the days when you've gone into church service, or you've gone into youth group, or you've gone to serving kids ministry and welcome people. And those times where prior to that, you sought the presence of God, and you're like, I'm filled to the brim. And then how do we make that more of a priority in our local communities? Because I think if anything should be ultimate, that's it.
Yeah.
Not even serving, not the doing, not even evangelizing and discipling, the presence of God, which is the foundation of all those things. How do we practically make that more of a value and a priority in our local church communities? Even if it's already like a priority, it can always become more of one.
Sure.
Yeah. So how do you do that?
I think when you start to personally take your faith seriously, you can walk into your communal setting with a desire to then make that a part of your, whether it's weekly, whether it's bi-weekly, if it's daily, like whatever that is for your community. It starts to become more serious in your group. Like if we're let's give a different example, doing a discipleship group or something like that. If we see that there's lacking of a communal aspect of seeking after the presence of God, I think that starts individually, because then when we come together, there would then be one vision in seeing that, okay, there's something missing. Okay, there's something we're missing out on here. There's some aspect that we need to add, and whether that's worship, before our meetings, whether that's praying more often, we will clearly see that there's an element to our meetings or an element to our gatherings that needs to be had. So I would say it starts individually to point those things out, but then also as you're gathering together, having that healthy conviction, come into play.
Yeah. I'm thinking about those times where in church it was pretty obvious, because I was in the leadership. Yeah. Where it was pretty obvious that the presence of God was not as much of a value as it should have been. It was very obvious. I was like my daughter there. It was it was very obvious in the meetings that it was like tasks oriented, do.
Yeah.
How we doing on the tech? How we doing on the building? How we doing on the, budgets? And it was all about the tasks, and then boom, we're out. And then there were times where it was like, well, we do say we're a church, so we kind of need to make it kind of feel like we're seeking the presence of God above all else. So let's spend some time in prayer. And it seemed kind of forced. Then there were times where it was like, okay, as we're opening our leadership meetings and talking about the week or what we need to do for the month, we are actually making time to say, God, you are first and ultimate.
Yeah.
And there's our kids yelling in the background. Not our kids, but like my wife's kids.
No, probably both of ours.
Actually, it's probably true.
Yeah.
Your little girl's probably yelling.
Yeah, it's possible.
And she's probably like heading the charge. Yell with me. And can you think of any times in your church leadership experience where there were moments of like, we as a church leadership are not prioritizing the presence of God right now?
Yeah.
And how did that affect, I guess, everything that was being done in that moment or on that day or for that event, whatever it was? Can you think of any moments? If our kids yell in the background,
we apologize.
Get over it.
Yeah, it's all right. So to start off, like, I think organization is great. Like, I think having a plan for like meetings and all that different stuff, a timeline and all that stuff is good, right? But I think there's a balance between being organized, but then also being spirit-led. Because sometimes there's spontaneous moments where it's like, okay, like I feel like we're supposed to pray for like 15 minutes rather than 5. Or like we're supposed to spend more time in the Word in this meeting longer than we normally do, or things like that. So I think there's a healthy balance. There's a fine line with discernment where we can go into a meeting or we can go into a time of coming together where we are very intentional when it comes to spending more time with God together. Because personally, there was moments where I was like, man, I needed more time of worship. Man, I needed more time with prayer with my community. I needed more time with discussing how life is going with one another. Because I mean, when I can't share my heart, sometimes I feel disappointed because my brothers and sisters don't know what I'm, going through or things like that. So again, like I love organization, but there was times for me where like I felt like an emptiness almost because there wasn't that aspect of like allowing the Spirit to come in and kind of take over, if that makes sense.
And that's a good point. I'm not saying that, prioritizing God's presence means no guidelines, no structure, no organization, no goals. We're saying like if those things supersede the presence of God and become more important and more valuable, you're going to end up seeing that trickle down into the congregation. And I guess we can even talk about how like in church community gatherings, some gatherings in local churches can be so rigid and so structured that, like you said, there's no time for spontaneous movement of the Spirit to lead in prayer. There's no set aside time to just sit as a congregation and pray together whatever is on your heart. It's like 10:15 worship's done, 10:30 we have the sermon starting because announcements and prayer are in between, and you need to be done preaching at least by 11.
Yeah.
And there is structure, there is organization, there should be like, let's be respectful of people's time.
Right.
But I think we should also respect the will of the Spirit, which might actually go against our agenda a little bit, and make some room for that. So, it's worth touching on the fact that not all churches, local, not that we're ragging on churches in general, but not all churches actually get behind this mentality of prioritizing the presence of God, because for so long they've been numbers oriented. For so long it's been task oriented and all about doing and how are the numbers and who's coming in and how do we keep them, and then there's not much time to seek God. But again, if you don't seek Him, any amount of success and things that you see as valuable, it won't really be all that it should. And so I guess the last question as it relates to the communal life of the church is, what gets in the way of our local church? And I'm talking to you, listener. What gets in the way of your local community and church leadership from prioritizing God's presence? Like, is it goals? Is it numbers? Is it, a desire to do good things and events and all the planning that goes into that, that there just simply isn't enough time to actually sit and prioritize the presence of God as a community, as a leadership. And if the leadership does not, we've seen this in the Old Testament, if the leadership does not have a value for the presence of God, it does trickle down into the congregation. And God talks a lot about how the prophets and the priests are garbage in the Old Testament, and the people end up following in their footsteps.
Yeah.
And they start to take on those trash-like qualities. You got a bunch of trash cans, it's probably offensive, but their lives are amounting to trash. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Worshiping idols and committing sexual immorality. And so what gets in the way of, for you, what have you seen gets in the way of a local church and leadership prioritizing God's presence? What can kind of compete for God's spot in the value system?
Yeah, I've seen performance get in the way. For me, when I've been in, ministry positions or, whatever it might be, when we get so tied up with the task doing, it ends up distracting us from the ultimate goal, which is discipleship. Man, the amount of times that I was disappointed because we didn't, talk about those kinds of moments, and we just started talking about, well, here's the next event, and here's the, our budget, and, all those things are good. I'm not saying those things are bad, right? Like, it's good. Again, organization's great. But when you get so caught up in the task doing or the performance aspect of maybe even just Sunday morning worship, like even if it's that, oh, we need to do these 4 songs and, we need to have this, response moment at this time, rather than the Spirit just, leading. And again, I'm not against organization at all, but I'm saying there were plenty of times where I was disappointed because there was that lack of just the Spirit leading and allowing just to take over these different, times of meetings. So that's what I would say.
And even beyond Sunday service, we could talk events. We could talk about Bible studies that happen outside the church or within the church. We can talk about worship gatherings, and we can talk about, all these different things that if you have a higher value for appearance and success and performance, the presence of God gets lost in the process.
Yeah.
And so, we could talk about how to make sure that doesn't happen, but I think it's helpful to at least identify some obstacles within local church communities and in church leadership. It can be the appearance. We want to appear successful.
Yeah.
We want to even, modernize what we're doing. And, the unbeliever, we're seeker oriented, and that's fine. Be aware of the people that are coming in, step in their shoes, be understanding, see from their eyes. But if it means, in the process, you're kind of minimizing the value of God's presence, well, an unbeliever won't sit through this. So we don't want to have too long of a time of prayer, and we don't want to have too long of worship and praise, and we don't want to look like we're crazy. Then you're really starting to make a shift towards things that you're going to regret later. So I just think that appearance of success, that performance based mentality, does get in the way.
It does. Yeah.
And even I hate to say it, but the whole concept of church finances and budgeting and the money kind of issues that come with leadership and supporting my family and making sure the church is good and bills are paid, that can honestly begin to trickle into the decisions we make. And if you're making decisions out of a fear of lack instead of prioritizing the presence of God and desire for His presence, that's just no bueno.
And I would even add to that, I think you hit it right on the nail. When it comes down to your fear making decisions for you instead of God's purpose and will, that's when your leadership starts to trickle down in a negative way. I've seen it, in church settings. I've seen it in home settings. I've seen it in creative, aspects and things like that, whether it's music or videos or, all that stuff. When fear becomes your decision maker, you tend to lead in the wrong direction. Actually, you always will. Let me correct that. You always will.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. Fear is a garbage leader.
Yep.
Fear is a garbage leader. So as we close, we're going to try every episode to hit on these different categories. Okay, we're going to try and bring up some good general questions that are worth answering and thinking through. We're not going to answer them exhaustively, just give you some ideas on how to, figure these things out. We'll talk through like some of our own experiences in ministry and try and be relatable and help you go, man, I'm in that same situation, and that's how they work through it. We'll try and give you some words of wisdom and application as we talk through these things congregationally and individually. And then the last thing we want to do is, I understand that there's people listening who are going to be a part of physical churches, okay? And you might not have a leadership role. You might have zero leadership titles and badges, and that's fine. That doesn't mean you can't lead. That doesn't mean you can't lead by example and be faithful and start to follow Jesus in a way that other people start to follow you. But also we want to touch on the aspect of those of you that are leading or, I don't know, dabbling in the whole online church space. If you're creating content, if you're evangelizing online, if you're creating an online Discord server, if you're making TikTok videos, if you're creating Bible studies and you're trying to figure that out, we want to ask a couple questions that would be helpful for you specifically.
Sure.
So whether you're a pastor, a preacher, online content creator, YouTuber, TikToker, you're just trying to be faithful in the online space, one question to ask is this, and answer. Is your content, is your preaching, is your sermon really centered around God, or is it centered around the person or you? Because you can have man-centered preaching, man-centered content, and even me-centered preaching and content, or it could be God-centered. And also, is the heart behind your content, the why, centered around God? Not just the what we're doing, but the why we're doing it. That's something to really think through as you make stuff, because there have been some videos I had to like really stop in the middle of planning the outline or planning the sermon, or even in the middle of preaching it, and really take a step back and go, oh, this is becoming very me-centered and all about my appearance and my influence and my platform. Or this is becoming very centered around the person listening. And it doesn't mean there can be no relatability or application, but, you know, or the why behind why I'm doing this is for more clout, for more, to gain more followers, to get more likes, to get more people to subscribe. And if that's your why, I'll tell you right now, it's not a big enough why to sustain real godly ministry.
Yeah.
It's not. So, I don't know, is there anything you want to speak into that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm a creative person, you know, visually, musically, like whatever it might be. I have found many times where I've been trying to do a project or a song or, you know, whatever it might be, and I'm finding myself gravitating towards self-reliance, finding myself trying to perform for myself, and I'm getting lost in my own emotions, the struggles that I'm going through and things like that. I tend to gravitate towards self-reliance and self-approval, like trying to gain self-approval from people and things like that. So when I catch myself doing that, I have to stop, and I have to, again, it's taking that step back and looking at, okay, why am I creating? Why am I doing this project? You know, what is my purpose behind it? Is it for people to gravitate towards God, or is it to gravitate towards me? And so I have found that in my performance, it can either be to glorify God through the talents and gifts that He's given me, or I could do it to promote self. And I've found that I'm actually less successful, first and foremost, but then also less satisfied when I do it for self. It's disappointing.
Ding, 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 ding. You nailed it. Less satisfied in the process. Because guess what? No amount of success, followers, influence, platform will ever satisfy you the way God can. So if you're not getting satisfied by the presence of God, you'll look for your content or your audience or your church congregation or even your kids and spouse to satisfy you in a way that only God can. And then your methodology and content will very clearly be evidence of that. Right. So, you know, I'm going to talk to you pastors, teachers, shepherds, content creators, Bible study leaders, those of you that are planners in creating content. You need to listen right now. And I say this lovingly, you can never allow your content or your sermon to be a replacement for the presence of God. You cannot. You cannot say, well, I'm reading my Bible by planning my message. looking for a sermon and looking for a message to give is not the same thing as just sitting before the Lord with no pressure of delivering it to someone. That's not the same thing. So sometimes you leaders and content creators, you need to take a step back. You parents that are planning little studies for your kids, you need to take a step back from the content you're planning. As weird as it sounds, like your message, your sermon is content. You need to take a step back, maybe even pause for a season, for a week, for a couple of days, and have nothing to do with that. Reorient yourself around the presence of God, and then get back to doing that.
Yeah.
Because that content, I got to serve and deliver and be accurate to the scriptures and teach faithfully, that can slowly begin to replace my time with God, where there's no pressure of performing or delivering or planning, just to be with him, just to seek his face. So the last question is, for you guys listening, is, within your content, within your Bible studies, within your preaching, whatever you're doing, right, within your Christian TikToks, is it obvious that your content and leadership, or is your content and leadership evidence that you prioritize the presence of God? Like, is it obvious when I watch your videos? Is it obvious when I see you stand up and lead the church, or when you lead a Bible study, or when you get around your kids to lead your family? Is it obvious that this person really prioritizes the presence of God? And of course, there's different ways to gauge that, and you can't fully determine that. I can't fully assess that and go, yes, but is there any evidence at all that, wow, this person has intimacy with God, a real abiding friendship with God that they prioritize above all the other stuff in their life? Is there evidence of that? It's a good question to ask. I don't know. Maybe it's not something we could answer, but something to just reflect on as we end today's episode. Is there any other final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just with both of these questions, I guess, I think once you catch yourself, because, we tend to do that when we actually self-reflect. We catch ourselves doing something that we haven't really realized because we haven't been reflecting. But when you finally self-reflect and you realize that you aren't prioritizing the presence of God, whether it's in your content creation or it's in your service, in your ministry setting, whatever that is, once you catch yourself, I think it's really healthy to take a pause, to take a break. And maybe that means you step away just for a brief time or for a moment to regroup with yourself, to recharge, to finally, pull yourself into a healthy space with prioritizing the presence of God. I think that will absolutely benefit you in so many ways, rather than just jumping right back into it thinking that you have it all together.
Yeah, don't be prideful.
Nope.
Don't be dumb. Balance these things. Because we talked about extremes and floating between the two. And so as we close, think about this. Is your leadership, is your content, is your preaching and message, is it obvious within that, wow, this person really prioritizes the presence of God? Not that you should concern yourself with appearing as a person who prioritizes the presence of God, and I just care what you think about me.
Matthew 6.
But I want people to see God in what I'm doing. And if I have not been with him myself, it is hard to give them an accurate reflection of him when I haven't been with him myself.
Sure.
So I think that's it for today. Go and reflect on that. Be faithful, and let's learn to function as the local church. Hey, thanks for listening to today's Above Reproach Church podcast. If you've benefited from this content or this ministry in any way, there are a number of ways you can support what we're doing to help people move towards Jesus. We're completely funded by generous supporters like you, so if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can head to abovereproachministry.com/donate, and you can give through debit or credit card, you can give through PayPal, Venmo, Patreon, or even just mail a check to P.O. Box 338, Green Cove Springs, Florida 32043. Or grab some of our church merch to represent Jesus on your body wherever you go. Either way, while you're on the website, check out all of our free resources, our online church, my book Fruitful, as well as everything else going on in our online ministry. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep moving towards Jesus.